Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a fourth time by Dr. Kevin Mitchell. He's Associate Professor of Genetics and Neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. Last time we talked about his book, Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about free will. And in the meantime, Dr. Mitchell had a couple of debates with Dr. Robert Sapolsky. We're also going to talk a little bit about that. And also about his recent paper, The Genomic Code, the genome instantiates a generative model of the organism. And toward the end, a little bit about human embryo editing. So, Dr. Mitchell, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure to chat.
Okay, so I would like to ask you a few questions that I left out in our previous conversation about your book on free will. So, what is the lowest level of analysis we have to go down when it comes to biochemistry to understand the evolution of free will and how it works?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and I've been hanging out with philosophers so much that I have this trigger now to when someone asks me a question to think, oh, where's that question coming from, and why is it phrased that way? And I think what's interesting here is there's this impulse when we look at some complicated phenomenon, like humans apparently having free will, where the phenomenon is we see that we're making decisions. It feels internally like we're thinking about things and deliberating and making choices and so on, right? So the question is, like, how could we account for that? And there's a natural impulse, I think, in traditional sort of science to look down for the explanation, to say, okay, well, clearly your mind is thinking about something, you've got goals and beliefs and so on that are informing your decision, but actually that's just neural states, right? So we can look down a level from cognition to the level of neuroscience and say, well, here, look, there's these patterns of neural states. And then we can go a little further and say, actually, you know what's happening in the brain is really these biochemical triggers are moving around. We've got proteins moving in and out, ions moving in and out. And there's some sort of biochemical molecular goings on. And there's a temptation, I think, to think that's where the true causal explanation lies. We go down, 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 and we see all these biochemical machinations, right? These mechanisms at play. And then we say, okay, that's why you made a decision, because these ions moved from here to there in these neurons, and these neurotransmitters were detected by those receptors, and that's it, we're done. And so I want to resist that impulse. And I want to say, actually, for a phenomenon like this of a whole organism doing complex context-dependent behavior informed by its history, we have to look up, right? We have to look at the whole thing. We have to take a holistic view of it and say, okay, yeah, there's, of course, it depends on all of this neural machinery, all this biochemistry, but that it can't be reduced to that. Decision making is not just a bunch of ions moving around. It's the sort of, I guess, manipulation of meaningful patterns that mean something to the organism, where there's a cognitive economy that depends on neural machinery, but it runs on meaning, and that, I think, is really the crucial difference, I think, that frees us from this reductive idea where it doesn't mean we're invoking some kind of magic, right? We can still see the machine needs to be there, and from neurology and genetics, we can see that differences in the way the machine is put together affect things like decision making. So it's still very materialistic in that sense. It's just not reductive. And I guess the other aspect of your question maybe was to think in evolutionary terms. How far back do we have to go to get a handle on things like purpose and meaning and value, right? And that's where I think taking a view of the simple biochemistry of organisms, like bacteria, I shouldn't say simple, it's actually quite complex, but much simpler than our kind of cognitive systems. Like, how could we get a handle on something like purpose in a non-magical, non-mystical kind of a way, by thinking about what bacteria are doing, and this basically the drive to survive. Any complex system like that can be configured in ways that favor its persistence or that don't. Right, and the ones that the configurations that do favor persistence persist, and those are the ones that we see. And of course, they have adaptations to keep favoring their persistence and doing that work. And in bacteria, that's done with biochemical systems. When multicellular organisms arose, they had to kind of reinvent the systems to figure out what's out in the world and mount appropriate adaptive responses to it.
But do you classify single-celled organisms like bacteria as agents? And when exactly in evolution does agency really come into play?
Yeah, my feeling, and I'm not I don't like to try and draw, bright lines, but my feeling is that actually agency is pretty much coextensive with life as we know it. That is, that even single-celled organisms like bacteria have some kind of, at least a proto-agency, in the sense that they're controlling their behavior in a holistic, integrative kind of a way. They're not just passive stimulus response machines. They're endogenously active, and they're accommodating to new information, but they're integrating multiple sources of information at a time, integrating it with respect to their recent history, with respect to their internal states, with respect to the external context, and all in the service of agent level reasons, right? So their parts don't have reasons for doing anything, but the whole organism does. You could say they're as if reasons, right? They're just evolution's reasons. But I think the effect is the same. We get a goal-directed behavior. It's directed towards whatever favors persistence. That may be going towards a food source. It may be going away from toxic chemicals or something that could eat it, right? So those kinds of things are all active, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to think of bacteria in agential terms. Now, it's not very sophisticated, right? There aren't many levels of behavioral control that it's engaged in, but it is still very much a holistic, organismal kind of activity, as opposed to purely just mechanism.
And when we talk about organisms which already have a nervous system, is there anything at the neuronal level or the neural molecular machinery that is important to consider to understand free will? I mean, something about synapses, neurotransmitters, membrane receptors, something like that, that is important to understand where free will comes from molecularly?
I guess I'd say two things there. First of all, it's important to understand how noisy that all is, right? How just messy and jittery and jiggly all of this, the molecular machinery is down there. I mean, you've got individual molecules that are jittering around. There's all kinds of thermal fluctuations. They're being bombarded by collisions, maybe like billions of times a second. Every molecule is just being hit by other molecules billions of times a second. Right? Yeah. So you've got this big noisy maelstrom of stuff down there, and it's amazing that there's any functionality at all. Right? It's incredible that actually evolution has crafted these systems that are, generally speaking, robust to that noise. They can still do things effectively at a slightly higher sort of macroscopic systems level, just because of the way that that evolution has configured them in a way that the macroscopic organization allows things to happen. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but that's really the key. It gets us away from the idea that everything at the low level is really deterministic and all the causes are coming bottom up, because actually it's just there's a load of random stuff happening down there that has to be harnessed, in a sense, at a slightly higher macroscopic level for anything useful to happen. And that is a kind of a key. aspect to understanding how free will can emerge, because free will is just it's a type of macroscopic causation, right? It's a type of top-down causation, and some people hear that, they hear top-down causation, and they think it's some mystical thing that sort of violates the tenets or principles of materialism, and it doesn't. It's just saying that the way a system is organized can have some causal effects on what happens, and it's a move away from thinking only in terms of what we can call production causes, the sort of physical causes where there's some oomph to it. There's something hits something else, and there's a physical force, and you can understand a transmission of energy and momentum. And some people think that those are the only real causes, that those sorts of physical causes. But actually, what happens in a system is dependent on all kinds of other things, right? There's all sorts of dependence causes. What's the material that things are made out of? What's the configuration that they're in, which will determine the outcome of the way physical forces play out, and even determine the distribution of physical forces in the first place. So those dependence causes, I think, are really key to understanding free will, because in the nervous system, the way some pattern of neural activity is, the effects that it has, is not just a matter of like electricity hitting another neuron. This neuron is interpreting what's happening. It's asking, what are my inputs, and what should I do about them? And that depends on the configuration of the synapses. So, down at that level, if you're asking what's important to think about in the neural system, the configuration of the system is doing interpretive work. And that, for me, is really key. That's why, I like to say that the system runs on meaning, because the effect of any pattern of neural activity is highly, highly context dependent. And that context is, first of all, reflects the history of the organism, but secondly, reflects the current state of the organism. So, when you engage attention, when you change arousal, when you adopt a goal, when you understand something that you didn't understand before, there's top-down effects that change the local configuration of synapses. And there's, neuromodulatory effects and so on. And so those are the neural mechanisms whereby top-down mental causation can play out, again, without having any ghost in the machine.
So I had this question saved for later, but since you mentioned causation, and particularly top-down causation, let me ask you, when it comes to causation, do you think that our Western scientific tradition equips us well cognitively with the appropriate tools and framework to understand it? Because, as you said, I can't remember exactly the terms you used, but sometimes when we think about a top-down causation, it seems a little bit esoteric, and that in a way it would negate materialism or something like that. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at the history of causation, the philosophy of causation, and of scientific thought, then, I mean, this is a kind of a potted history, but, you can look back to Aristotle, for example, who had a very pluralistic notion of causation. And he talked about, he used some slightly weird terminology. We translated as, for example, the efficient cause and the material cause. So those would be things where basically like, what's the system, what's the stuff in the system made out of, and what are the forces that are at play? Okay, so it's matter in motion. Those are his causes, and those are perfectly good ways of thinking about causation within a system, but they're limited. They don't capture everything, because he had two other kinds of causes that he thought about. One was what he called the formal cause, which doesn't really translate into modern thought very directly, but the way I think of it is basically the configuration of the system, which is imposing some constraints on what can happen. It's just shaping the possibility space. And then, most famously, there was the final cause. Like, in his sense, it was, what is this for? Why did this happen? If you want to say, why did something happen? You can ask, how come it happened? How did it come to happen? But also, what for? Why did it happen? And that's a kind of a cause that teleology kind of got banished from Western scientific thought, and very explicitly by Francis Bacon in the 16th or 17th century, I can't remember exactly, where he basically exhorted people to just think about material and efficient causes and to not worry about these final causes, which seemed, again, kind of magical, because it seems like the end point, which is in the future, is somehow reaching backwards in time and changing things right now, right? Which obviously can't happen, shouldn't happen. That kind of retro causality is highly suspect. But you can just flip that around and say, no, that's not what's happening at all. When an animal has a goal,
Yeah.
There's a causal efficacy of its having a goal right now. It's not the future end state that's having an effect. It's the fact that the organism wants to get to it. That's what's having an effect. And that's a present state. That's a current state. And so there's no real problem with incorporating that. We just have to have a slightly more expansive view of causation that isn't so focused on matter in motion, and that encompasses these broader dependence causes or configurational causes. And I think neuroscience is actually moving that way, partly because the experimental methods that we have are now allowing us to do that. We're able to record more neurons in an awake behaving animals, and we're able to look at more contextual kind of stuff as opposed to simple isolated neurons or circuits, which, the danger of that reductive approach is that it makes it look like any behavior is being caused by the activity of certain bits within the organism, where the organism's not doing anything as an agent, it's being pushed around by its parts. And that's a danger of the paradigm of trying to isolate functions to specific neural circuits, when in fact that anything that's happening within the brain is always being interpreted in this more holistic global context.
There's also, I think, a very interesting question here surrounding how we understand ontology, because there's, for example, process ontology and substance ontology, and we in the West tend to think more in terms of substances instead of processes. Do you think that distinction is also important to keep in mind to understand how neural systems operate and how free will comes about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very much in favor of a process view. I probably don't go all the way that some people do, where they say, the essence of things is processes and objects are just really slow processes. I don't really find that super helpful. I think we can still think of objects and entities, but they're engaged in processes. And what I want to think, I guess, is that the properties that anything has are inherently relational. They're always involved. Every property, even something like mass, where you would say that this subatomic particle has a mass. Well, that's a relation, right? That's a relational property with the Higgs field or whatever else it is, right? So when we start thinking in cognitive science terms, I like to think much more in terms of activities than objects. So even something like the word mind, you say, I have a mind, something's on my mind. It sounds like a noun, right? It sounds like an object, like a place where things are happening, where to me, it's just mind is a verb. It's mentality is a set of processes that have certain relations that support certain relations, both sort of internally, cognitively, and between the organism and its environment. And you could say the same thing with something like the term representation, where we'll say, within the brain there is a representation of something out in the world. Like right now, you're looking at my face, and you've got a representation of my face in your fusiform face area. That's fine. It's not wrong. It's just not super useful, because it's more interesting to me to say that you are representing, right, as an activity, and that activity requires not just the presence of that particular pattern of activity, but the way that it's interpreted by other parts of the brain and what it means to you as an organism. And so I think, moving to this kind of process view where we're talking about activity and relations, just better captures what's actually happening. There aren't these isolated elements and objects. Even there aren't isolated cognitive objects. There are things that we may be thinking about, and that thinking may be supported by current activational state of populations of neurons. But those, the meaning of those neurons inheres in the connections that they have with other parts of the brain, right? The meaning is evoked. It's not contained in a local pattern. The local pattern doesn't do anything by itself. It has to be interpreted. So yeah, I think, I guess more than just the distinction between the substance and process ontology, I guess I'm favoring these days a much more dynamical, relational view of what's going on.
So let me ask you a different kind of question now. When we are simulating possible courses of action, when we are in the process of decision making, do we know why certain possibilities spring to mind and not others? I mean, because in many instances, I'm not sure if in all instances, but at least in many instances, it seems to be that there would be a near infinitude of possibilities to consider, but that's not how our decision-making processes work. We only tend to consider a limited number of possibilities.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really key because you've hit on the problem of behavioral control, right? We have too many options. We just have this infinity of options. And we can't, in any scenario, run through them all in some sort of rational calculation that's weighing them all up, because we'd be dead, right? We just have to do something fast. So decision making has to involve lots of heuristics. It has to involve, first of all, habits, where there's literally just habits of behavior where effectively we don't have to think about it at all, right? We just know in this scenario, do X or do Y, right? Because it's worked out well in the past. So that's really useful. That's a way to offload the cognitive work to cached policies, which we've learned are good. But we also have habits of thought. And that's equally important in that in a given scenario, we may not know exactly what to do, but we may have certain sort of more practiced ways of thinking about what to do. Right? So there may be some set of options that will occur to us that's highly constrained, right? So it's already narrowing down the possibility space or the search space for thinking about what to do, which is, again, super effective most of the time, right? And so the challenge is when we encounter a completely novel scenario where we're really out of our depth, we have no idea what to do. And then, often the best thing to do is to gather more information, for example, or sometimes if we have to act, to just do something kind of slightly at random. And actually, in many cases, we may make use of the noisy elements of neural signaling and just allow that to drive a behavior when we don't know what we should do, or we don't care what we should do, but we should do something. So there's always some noisiness at play there. But what's interesting, in this sort of scenario you're thinking about, when ideas pop into our mind, we could say, okay, where did that idea come from? Well, usually they don't come from nowhere. They're usually informed by our kind of just general background knowledge of how things work and how we should behave, right? So they're not random completely. But there may be various options that occur to us. And then there's a model which actually goes back to William James, at least, called the two-stage model of free will, where the idea is, given some scenario you find yourself in, some options occur to you. And in neuroscience terms, you could say some patterns of activity within the parts of the cerebral cortex which represent possible actions become primed or activated, right? And then they get submitted to this evaluation system. So this, the current thinking at least is that this involves the basal ganglia, evaluative systems in the midbrain, the thalamus, and then loops that go back to the cortex. And you can think about this as these competing patterns that are vying for control of the motor system, where actually what the basal ganglia are doing is most of the time just putting the brakes on the motor system. They're absolutely just stopping everything until they decide in this competition to let one of those actions through, and that can drive the motor command centers. At least that's one way to look at it. So in that scenario, James famously said, "My thoughts come to me freely, my actions go from me willfully." Right? So you've got a sense there where there is some randomness in what occurs to you to do, constrained by prior knowledge, but then you're making these evaluative decisions based on what you think is going to turn out the best.
Do you think that we should think about the fact that we do not consider all possibilities that would be out there in our decision making a constraint on free will? Because, probably this is something that Robert Sapolsky and other people like him would say that, or would argue that, because we are influenced by our prior experiences in terms of what kinds of options spring to mind, that would be an argument against free will.
Yeah, well, okay, so there's two ways to look at this. One is to say it's only free will if there are no prior causes affecting you whatsoever, right? There's no constraints whatsoever from your past or towards the future or anything else, right? Which is kind of a weird scenario. If you take it to its logical conclusion, like you would just be doing random stuff, right? You're not allowed to have any memories, any goals, any preferences, any habits, any attitudes or dispositions or policies or commitments or ongoing projects or anything that makes you you, right? And just at every moment, you'd have to be doing something random. And, obviously that's not, life isn't like that, right? I mean, at its very, very basic, what life is, what life does, what living organisms do is make themselves happen. Right? They continuously make themselves happen through time. Out of all the things that could happen, they make this happen, where this is their continued existence. And so that's the whole thing. Like, that's life's whole shtick, is this sort of historicity. So to imagine this scenario where you're ultimately free and can do anything you want, well, you'd have to ask, well, why would you want anything? You wouldn't be you. There'd be no self there, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. The other thing is to say, well, to get back to what I just said a minute ago, that these constraints from your past are super, super adaptive, right? I mean, you just can't in every scenario work through every possible thing that you could do with your body, right? Like, I mean, just imagine all the things you could do with your body right now that you're not doing. So you don't have to think about the 99.99999% of those, right? There's only little options where you do think about it. And so, what Robert Sapolsky argues is that all of those past effects, your genetics, human evolution generally, the way your brain developed, what hormones you were exposed to in the womb, and then all the experiences that have happened to you, narrow down your decision making to one option. In every scenario, it's determined what you're going to do by all of those prior factors. And there's simply no evidence for that whatsoever, right? Of course, there are influences, but what he does is look at all these sort of separate influences and say, well, gosh, that's a lot. It seems to me like they must collectively preclude anything being up to you as an agent. And that's just kind of vibes. There's really no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. It doesn't fit with the phenomenology of our experience of deliberation. It doesn't fit with the neuroscience that we see of decision making under conflict, where you can literally see these kinds of competitions happening, where the decision making, the behavioral control is not this instantaneous transition from a state to another state. It's like, okay, I'm now in state A, I'm at time t, and it's just a physical system, and it's configured a certain way, and it's going to go to state B at time t plus 1. Like those are some instantaneous transition. It's a process, right? Deliberation, when we're really, deliberating under conflict, takes time. We have to. We don't just run through, inputs into the algorithm as if the algorithm is all set up to deal with this novel scenario. In any new scenario, we have to figure out what the weights of the algorithm should be, right? We have to figure out what's relevant to us now and work through that process and weigh up these alternatives and then choose one that feels like that's what we're doing. The neuroscience shows that's what we're doing. And there's no reason to think that that can be sort of short-circuited, or that there's just some lookup table that we can appeal to in every scenario that we're in. And to me, that just is you making a decision. Like, yes, it involves your brain. Of course it does. But what else would it involve? Just because there's bits, there's a physical instantiation of it, doesn't mean it's not you doing it. And I think that, Robert's view with respect to him, I think, has this underlying dualism to it. It's like every time we show some of the neuroscience of decision making, he thinks, aha, see, it's not you, it's your brain. But that's just a dualist idea, that the only thing that would satisfy him is if we could find the ghost in the machine. And of course, he says, like a good materialist, there can't be a ghost in the machine, therefore there's no free will.
But at a certain point in your book, you say that it can pay off to behave randomly sometimes. Could you explain that?
Yeah, well, I mean, a good example is when creatures are escaping from a predator. And in fact, many animals have systems that basically randomize their escape trajectory. So they have like a jump response or something like that. I'm thinking of insects, for example. But the direction in which they jump is highly indeterministic. And it seems to vary along with just some noisy conditions in the nervous system at the moment. And that's adaptive because if you were really predictable, if you always escaped one direction, then predators could just take advantage of that, right? So if you're super predictable, you're lunch, and that's just bad, right? So I think organisms can allow some randomness to be at play in that kind of scenario. And we talked about this a minute ago, this idea of ideas popping into your head. And there's a certain scenario where some ideas pop into your head, you try them out, right? You've got some goals, and but we don't just take decisions and then that's it. We monitor those decisions, right? So our behavioral control is very much extended through time. It's not just these momentary decisions. We're engaged in activities, and we monitor those for some time to see if we're achieving our goals. Now, if we're not, then there's mechanisms that involve release of norepinephrine from the locus ceruleus, which is the blue spot in the hindbrain or midbrain, which goes to the cortex and basically kind of allows there to be a bit more noise. It sort of raises the temperature of the system in an information theoretic use of the term temperature there, and sort of shakes the system up a little bit, shakes it out of its ruts of habits of thought, and broadens the search space. And you can see how that's adaptive. If it's kind of the equivalent of going back to the drawing board and thinking outside the box, right? So thinking creatively by taking advantage of a little bit of noisiness, which just allows you to explore a wider search space. And you can see, a parallel with evolutionary search there, where evolution depends on random variation generating options, which it then tests. And it's sort of a similar analogous situation there.
Do you think that what you explore in your book in terms of free will, and that applies to biological systems, could also apply to artificial intelligence systems?
Yeah, I mean, this is where this becomes much more than an abstract philosophical debate that you have down the pub on a Friday night, right? So it becomes really important because we can think beyond the yes or no question, do we have free will or not? And instead we can ask, what are the systems that support rational cognitive behavioral control? And what are the systems of goal, goal choice, action choice, nested hierarchical control, motivations, simulation, evaluation, right? All of those things have neural basis to them. And we can think about those in both in terms of the really, really particulars of the operations that are going on, but also in a slightly more abstract way, again, in a more relational way. We can say, what are the kinds of cognitive operations that an agent has to be able to do in order to get around in the world, right? Where do its goals come from? How does it decide between them? How does it basically solve this big optimization problem when faced with novel, unpredictable, uncertain environments and limited information and time pressures to act? Okay, so we can get, and we are getting, a handle on those kinds of systems, how they work, what functionalities they engender, and how they can be put together to enable adaptive action. Now, with all of that knowledge, there's nothing to stop us, I think, from saying, okay, we could absolutely operationalize that in an artificial system. We could do it in a virtual agent wandering around in Minecraft or something like that, or we could do it in a robot that's actually encountering the real world. The difference, I think, from current AI systems like ChatGPT and stuff like that is those systems are not embodied. They're not engaging with the world. They're not designed to, right? Nobody was trying to make them really be agents. They have no sort of causal relationship with the world, right? They're not doing things, noticing the outcomes of their actions, updating their model of the world accordingly, and so on. They're just not immersed in an environment. But there's no reason why you couldn't make things that have those kinds of embodiment, embeddedness, and what you might call, in-mindedness. They're not just embodied, but they have a cognitive architecture that basically gives them some kind of mentality, some kind of subjective experience within the world, where they distinguish themselves as an entity from the rest of the world, where they understand they have a causal influence on the world and vice versa. They're modeling self and world and the relations between those. It seems quite possible in principle. At least I see no argument against it in principle that that we could build systems like that. People are working on it. I think we'll get to things in short order that we have to have some kind of agency, and then we're going to be in a world of ethical and practical dilemmas that we're going to have to grapple with.
So you think that if we are able to someday build AI systems that are embodied, embedded, I mean, probably the full 4E cognition there, that they could possibly have free will as well?
Yeah, again, I think that the answer here is to back away from the metaphysical and just operationalize what we mean by free will. Right? Okay. So, would it have behavioral autonomy? Would it be able to make its own goals, not along the way, right? Not just play out the goals that were pre-programmed into it. Would it have some individual agency in terms of both choice and control, right? So choice in the sense that it has options, it has options in the world, but it also has internal options, right? There's nothing predetermined, as we were just talking about its cognitive operations. There's some play there. And control in the sense that given that there's some play in its cognitive operations in deliberating about what to do, there's scope for it to have top-down control over what it does based on its current high-level goals, the goals of the entity, right? Not the just the activity of its parts, because the parts don't have goals. Right? And so if we can build a system like that, that's acting autonomously in the world, that's learning things, that's accumulating from its history, it's accumulating causal potential. Right? It's building up a knowledge of the world that's giving it greater causal control in the world. To me, that would be an agent. If you wanted to say it had free will, there's so much baggage around that term. You could argue back and forth, but for all intents and purposes, it wouldn't be any different from something that we would say does have free will. That's a sort of pragmatic way of approaching what could otherwise devolve into a semantic dispute.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your debates with Robert Sapolsky. I watched two of them. I'm not sure if there are more out there. I watched one in late 2023 and another one last year. So what would you say you learned from them?
It's interesting. So Robert is he's a great neuroscientist, and as two neuroscientists, it's interesting that we sort of look at things with through very different perspectives, and we look at somewhat the same body of evidence, not completely, and we just take very different kind of conclusions from it. And usually when that's the case, there's some underlying premises that differ, right? We're bringing different things to the party that kind of explain that. And I guess for me, my sense is, again, with respect, that Robert has this kind of closet dualism, where he defines free will both in an absolutist sense, that is, if there's any prior causes whatsoever, then you're not completely free, you don't have free will, it just doesn't count. I find that notion incoherent for the reasons that we discussed earlier, because you wouldn't be you if there weren't any prior causes. And then secondly, there's this sort of dualist intuition that I think he has, although he'd absolutely deny it, right? But where he will say, he wants to say that free will is somehow in the brain, but not of the brain, or in biology, but not of biology. He uses those kinds of phrasings where it's like we're stuck either, as we do our sort of materialistic project of neuroscience, it seems like all of the causation is located in the brain and there's nothing left for us to do. And, I just think that's wrong. And it's wrong because it locates all the causes at the lowest levels. And we can get out of that by thinking about emergence, which is another sort of philosophical, thorny issue that some people are kind of allergic to, because it sounds like you're getting some kind of magical thing popping out of a system when you organize it a certain way. And, I think you can think of emergence as, well, you have to think of selection at the same time, right? It's like a system could be configured in lots of different ways. Now, you're not going to get functionalities by chance, that persist. You're only going to get good functionalities because they've been selected for, right? So you can get these sort of top macroscopic configurations that it's not just that there are properties that you see at those emergent levels, it's that there are powers that inhere at the higher levels, and they constrain what's going on at the lower levels, right? It's just not the case that all the causation is bottom up. And that's a concept, again, that I think Robert and I differ on our views of that, in that I don't see any problem with that. But I think he thinks it's a kind of again, it's something magical about it. And I don't think that's true. So so those are some of the things. I guess the other aspect would be, it is interesting to think about the evidence that we lean on. So for Robert, a lot of it is kind of almost epidemiological behaviorism, where he'll say, okay, we can find, if we look across many people, we can see that people with this exposure could be, this genetic variant, or a history of child abuse, or higher levels of hormones in the womb, across this population of people, they tend to behave like this statistically more than other people, right? So that kind of evidence suggests that there are these influences on our behavior, but it's very statistical, right? It's in the aggregate. It's patterns of behavior where there are influences, but they're not determinants, right? Individually, none of them is a determinant, and collectively, there's no reason to think that they all are determinants either. So you can look at those kinds of studies, and first of all, some of those studies are just bad. Like there's some history of candidate gene association studies, which are just inflating the apparent effect that particular genetic variants have on our behavior, say. There's social priming studies, which again inflate the idea that unconscious things are driving our behavior. I mean, that whole literature is suspect. And then there's a bunch of other sort of studies that are effectively flawed, sometimes fatally so, where collectively the problem is that they give this impression of all these big effects. It's like we're just being buffeted around by all of these prior things or current states of the world that we're not really conscious of or in control of. And that paints a picture in a rhetorical sense, not in an actual edifice of scientific evidence. It just seems like, it makes it feel like we're really not in control of anything. But if you back off of that and you actually look at, the neuroscience of decision making in real time, not just what are the effects prior that feed out statistically on behavioral patterns, but right now in an animal that's making a decision, what's the neuroscience that's actually happening? There you get this picture of these extended, holistic, deliberative, integrative processes of the whole system trying to accommodate to new information, work through a sets of options, and figure out what to do. And so for me, that neuroscience that Robert doesn't really engage with that much just paints a very different picture from the kind of behavioral epidemiology where, the picture that you get, I think, is just not an accurate one. It's just very inflated, and it lends itself to these rhetorical arguments that I think don't help us get to an accurate scientific picture.
Yeah, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, or I got the impression from your debates that there are at least many aspects where you agree, particularly when it comes to probably the basic science that provides a basis to the debate, like the neuroscience, the biology, probably evolutionary aspects of it as well, physics, probably not so much, and also you probably disagree also when it comes to the social psychology that Dr. Sapolsky cites in his book, which I think is actually one of the weaker points because at least some of those studies haven't replicated well. So, but then at a certain point you part ways. Where do you think that point is exactly?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that we do agree on is that the most popular philosophical stance for many scientists and philosophers, which is compatibilism, doesn't hold up, right? So the idea of compatibilism, which really is concerned with physical predeterminism, the idea that at the lowest level of physics, everything's deterministic. There's an argument to be, so usually in the free will debate, historically, it's like, that's the way it's set up, as this dichotomy, free will versus determinism. If determinism is true, free will has a problem, right? And so free will skeptics would say, yeah, that's true. But compatibilists will say, no, even if the world is completely deterministic at physical levels, at the lowest levels of physics, we can still mount a defense at least of moral responsibility. If not free will in the sense that you could have done otherwise, at least we could say, well, still what you did for your reasons, and you were the cause of it happening, and the source of causation is within you as an entity, and therefore you can be held morally responsible. And both Robert and I don't accept that view at all. I think we both sort of are a bit perplexed by it because it just, I mean, for me, first of all, obviously there's no choice, right? So what are we even talking about? But also more fundamentally, in a universe, if the universe were like that, how would you ever get to having agents? Where do they come from? If we don't have variation and selection and macroscopic causation, the whole point of low-level physical determinism is it leaves no scope for macroscopic causation. There's nothing, right. There's no slack in the system. Everything just happens based on the low levels. So so Robert and I agree on that. I think we agree on, that taking an evolutionary approach is useful. We part ways on the neuroscience of decision making itself, in that he has this view where, I think he thinks of the brain as a great big complicated stimulus response machine. Mm-hmm. Put in a stimulus, which is given what we know about the current state of the world, and churn through the algorithm, and it spits out one answer, right? That's the sort of cartoon picture of deliberation that he invokes, and that's his whole argument, basically. And so, yeah, I completely disagree that that's an accurate picture of what's going on. It doesn't fit the neuroscience, it doesn't fit the psychology or cognitive science, and it doesn't even fit the first-person phenomenology of what it feels like to be making a decision under conflict. So, yeah, I guess that's where we part ways.
Okay, so let me ask you now, because I think that this is something that Robert Sapolsky would also argue for, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think that it would be possible for us to somewhere in the future, by gathering a lot of information on people's personality, prior experiences, and so on, to be able to predict people's behavior with at least a high degree of accuracy? And if so, what kinds of implications would that have for the free will debate?
Yeah. First of all, I think we do predict each other's behavior with a high degree of accuracy all the time, right? That's why we're not constantly surprised by everything that everybody does, because we have expectations of behavior based on the social settings, based on knowledge of people's character and personality. I mean, so much so that when people really start acting out of character, we often take it as a sign of mental illness, right? So we're really good at predicting individual people's behavior that we know. We're not as good at predicting the behavior of strangers, except in a broader sense where we'll say, okay, a person in this scenario, right? A person who has gone to a restaurant is likely to sit at a table and order food, right? That's fine, right? But we don't know if they're going to prefer lasagna or calamari, right? So yeah, I think we can think about, predicting each other's behavior as something that we just do all the time. In fact, that's kind of social cognition is the whole edifice on which civilization is built, right? That's our superpower, right? That's what enables us to be a hypersocial cooperative species, right? Mm-hmm. So we already do that. Now, the question is, could you do it in a really deterministic way by having some measurements of things, right? So if we think about personality psychology, what personality psychologists try to do is look at the broad dimensions along which human behavior tends to vary. So one of those would be like extroversion, introversion. That's a dimension along which people tend to vary. And it captures across the population and across many, many different contexts, it captures some patterns of behavior and allows you to kind of understand in that context why someone who's more extroverted would tend to behave like this more often than not, right? But it's really statistical and it's really abstracted from particular contexts. In fact, that's the whole point, is to get away from the particularities of any individual's life and any individual situation, context, and instead see, here's the dimensions, here's the sort of broad principles of human behavior. So if I gave you a personality test and I had your scores in front of me right now, and then I wanted to say, okay, what's Ricardo likely to say next? Well, his conscientiousness score is 6 and his extroversion score is 20. That has zero predictive power for me, right? So the question of kind of what parameters would you need to get in order to scientifically predict someone's behavior, and ultimately, I think you'd have to collect all of the particularities of their history and all of the particularities of the context that they're in such a way that it becomes so idiosyncratic that it just doesn't become a scientific enterprise in the sense of science looking for these abstract rules and principles that it can apply, because it just becomes a web of particularities, right? So, so I'm not inclined to think that we'll be able to make these kinds of predictions about anything complex. It may be possible in a brain scanner to, 100 milliseconds before somebody does it, to predict whether they're going to flick their right hand or their left hand. Fine. Like, who cares? It doesn't help. But having, more sophisticated kind of behavioral predictions, we can predict trends of behavior. We can sort of statistically predict behaviors. But, the question of how does that help? I mean, for example, you can predict statistically that you and I, because we both have a Y chromosome, are more likely to be violent, physically violent, than people who don't. Now, what are you going to do with that information? Nothing. What, are you going to lock us up preemptively because we're in the group of people who commit 90% of homicides?
Yeah, maybe Minority Report style or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of sort of science fiction-y scenarios which can be appealed to, but when you look at the actual science of human behavior, what we have on the one hand are these statistical aggregates and patterns, and then on the other hand, the real messy contextual particularities of any individual human's existence.
Yeah. So before we move on to other topics, let me just ask you one last question about your debates with Dr. Sapolsky. Did you change your mind in any way, even if just a small way?
It would be good. It would seem like I were a good scientist if I did change my mind, right? I should be open to having my mind changed. I didn't change my position. I changed the way I think about talking about it.
Okay.
And it highlighted, I guess, for me, some of the different views that people can have, including not just Robert, but many people in the audience, of course, of those debates, who also may bring something to the debates. And it might be a kind of, it might be this sort of closet dualism. It might be a lack of belief in the concept of emergence as a naturalistic sort of thing, or various other things like hang-ups about mental causation, for example, like how could a thought push material stuff around, those kinds of things. It's interesting to dig into the psychology, I think, of free will skepticism, because it often hangs on underlying things and notions of causation and things that aren't you have to excavate them a little bit. So yeah, I guess I learned those things. I don't did I change my mind? Again, I should say, I should find something to say I changed my mind about. I don't think I did, really. No.
I mean, even if it was just in terms of how you consider Dr. Sapolsky's arguments, I mean, are you at least a little bit more sympathetic toward some of them, or?
I think I understand where they're coming from better. And let me say, I mean, Robert is a lovely guy, and he's really, I think, a genuine guy, and thoughtful. Clearly, I don't agree with the conclusions of his thinking, but yeah, I've enjoyed interacting with him, and I think he's, his motivations are interesting in the sense that I think, one of the reasons why he wants to argue against free will is this idea that we're constantly blaming people, right? So, and I think it's colored by the American system in which he's embedded, that there's this sort of meritocratic view there, where, you know, if you're successful, it's because you worked hard, and you obviously deserve your success because you have it, right? That's the sort of the tautology of the meritocratic argument. And if you're poor, and you know, it's just because you've made bad choices, and you should be blamed for that, and in a sense you shouldn't be entitled to any help, right, or sympathy. And that's what he's kind of arguing against. I think that's his underlying motivation, and it goes all the way to the legal system in terms of you know, his argument that we should take into account people's prior circumstances and history and so on. But so I'm completely sympathetic to all of that, and I think it's absolutely important to understand that, you know, people in poverty, for example, don't have the same degree of freedom as people who have more resources and a luxury of more time and social safety nets and financial safety nets that allow them the freedom to make better choices and longer term, you know, follow longer term goals and so on, right? So I think all of that is really important. But for me, what that highlights is that free will is not an all or none thing. It's a graded thing, right? And it's important to understand, precisely for the reasons that Robert is articulating, why some people's freedom is constrained by external circumstances, but also by their internal constitution, right? You know, someone may be genetically and developmentally more impulsive than somebody else. And so, you know, should we blame them for that? That's a valid kind of discussion to have, and it's an interesting argument to have. And in fact, my prior book, Innate, was all about how the way our brain is wired shapes who we are in ways that are really innate, that we didn't choose, right? The problem is when Robert goes all the way to the extreme metaphysical position that nobody has any agency or free will at any moment ever, then he completely undercuts the argument that he wants to make. Like, if everyone's at zero, what comparison are you drawing? What contrast are you drawing between people with lots of freedom and to exercise their agency and people with lower freedom? If everyone's at zero, it just doesn't seem to make any sense. So I'm very sympathetic to the notion that we should take into account people's circumstances, both sort of internally and externally, in considering their behavior. In a way, I think we already do that. I mean, the legal system already does that, right? The legal system already differentiates between minors and adults because we know that the minors have less behavioral control. It differentiates between schizophrenics and healthy people, between people with drug addiction or not. And it differentiates between people who were, you know, had a history of abuse and neglect as children versus didn't. Right? So, yeah, I just don't think we need to go to push take the metaphysical nuclear option to make those points. I think, in fact, it undermines making those points when you do that.
So just to close off this section on free will, how do you think we should reframe the free will debate in science? Because as far as I understand it, it tends to start from a determinist position. Right?
Yeah. Okay. So it does. And so the first thing I'll say is that yes, we can just get rid of that. Right. Okay. So I have a paper out now on the archive with my student Henry Potter and George Ellis, who's a very eminent physicist, which is just collecting all of the evidence that physics is not in fact deterministic, right? It's not deterministic at quantum levels, and it's not deterministic at classical levels either, and it never has been. It's just an assumption or an idealization that's useful mathematically sometimes, but it's not a result of physics. So the idea that we need to start this debate on that turf is just wrong. That's not an accurate picture of what the universe is like. So instead, we have to flip that and say, okay, well, actually, in a universe where there's this low-level indeterminacy, where the future is open and many things could happen, well, now how do you get an agent with some control in that kind of a system, right? How does an agent make happen what it wants to happen in this big possibility space? And that reframing, I think, kind of highlights the notion of emergent macroscopic organization, where entities at higher levels have powers unto themselves that constrain things lower down. And that's a flip away from this bottom-up reductive causation view. And it also, allows us to take a kind of a more historical view of the emergence of these things, both evolutionarily and within an individual's lifetime, in terms of accumulating causal potential, as I was talking about earlier. So that's one aspect of, I think, reframing the free will debate within science. But the other aspect would be to just get over it, right? You just get over the yes or no question and say, let's just agree yes, and then ask in what way, right? What does it mean? What are the systems that enable that? And if you just, like, the easiest thing to do is just replace free will with executive function or behavioral control or decision making or action selection or whatever those kinds of things are, right? And actually get down to the nuts and bolts in a way that doesn't get hung up on metaphysics and can be operationalized like we talked about earlier in artificial systems, right? So it just means that we can just get down to it, to a science of free will, without once we get the clear the metaphysical brush out of the way.
Mm-hmm. So let's get now into your recent paper, the Genomic Code, the genome instantiates a generative model of the organism. So how do you apply the concept of a generative model in this particular case?
Yeah, so this is a paper I'm really excited about. It was with Nick Cheney, who's at the University of Vermont in the Department of Computer Science. And so it came about because I've, as a developmental biologist and geneticist, I've always been concerned with the question of how the genome instantiates the form of the organism, right? So you can ask the question, like, why, and this goes back to Aristotle. Why do cats have kittens and dogs have puppies? Why is that, right? And it sounds like a stupid, naive kind of question to ask, and then people kind of go, well, what are you even talking about? But it comes down to the question of, like, if you have a fertilized cat zygote and a fertilized dog zygote, like, where's the information that determines how those things are going to develop? Where's the cattiness or the dogginess? And of course, a lot of that is down to the genetic information in the genome as a whole. Now, let me just say, of course it needs an egg, of course it needs the right environment. There are lots of things that are given by the environment that are important and crucial for development to happen along typical lines that aren't encoded in the genome, and they don't have to be, right? They're just given, so the evolution doesn't have to do any effort to pack that information into the genome. Okay, so given that context, cats will develop, cat egg will develop as a cat because it has cat DNA. Right? If it didn't, it wouldn't. So the question is, like, how can we think about that? And there's a long history of ways of thinking about that. You can think of terms like a blueprint. That's a very common metaphor for the DNA. And it's bad, like it's a bad metaphor for several reasons. One is a blueprint, if you think of like a blueprint of a house, it has this isomorphic relationship to the house. That is, bits of the blueprint match bits of the house, and the scaled layout of the blueprint matches the layout of the house at a different scale, right? So nothing like that is there in the genome with the phenotype of the organism. There's no such relationship between a bit of the genome and my little finger and another bit of the genome and my eyeball and stuff like that, right? So a blueprint metaphor falls down pretty quickly, but also a blueprint shows you what the final product should look like, but doesn't show you how to build it, right? It's not a builder's plan for how to get there. So that's what the organism needs, is a plan for how to generate the thing that it wants to do, right? So some people have used the idea of a program. I think we can say there is a developmental program in the sense that there's a series of steps that tend to happen in embryogenesis. You get gastrulation, and then you get, the neural tube forms, and then, all these steps happen in a certain order. So that's one meaning of the term program. It's just a set of steps that happen according to a certain schedule. But of course, program invokes or evokes the idea of a computer program, right? This highly algorithmic thing where there's a series of steps laid out, written really clearly and separately, that's just run through in series. And again, if you look in the genome, you don't find a step that's written in one part of the genome that says gastrulate and another step here that says neurulate or make a brain or whatever, right? So that view also kind of falls down, and both the blueprint and the program also sound really deterministic, right? Like there's just, it's just algorithmic, or it's just this clear kind of mapping, right? So those things are not good models either. And what we're appealing to here is a different notion, which is really inspired by machine learning and by neuroscience as well. And it's the notion of a generative model. And we're all familiar with that these days because that's what ChatGPT is, a generative model of language. That's what Midjourney is a generative model of images, right? And the way that works is a model, say, for image generation is trained on lots and lots of images that usually are labeled in some way. So that's when we're doing, when you do the CAPTCHA thing that says tick all the boxes with a bridge or a fire hydrant or something like that, we're training these things for their image recognition, right? So the original kind of things were image classifiers, right? So they could be trained on lots of pictures of different things, dogs, cats, horses, houses, whatever, right? Told what they are, and then they build these kind of compressed representations that distinguish these different categories. So the point of that is that they're abstracting general information about the pattern of dogginess versus cattiness, say, so that when they see a new picture of a dog or a cat, they can fit it into these high-level abstract categories. And then, of course, what happened was people were using that to say, well, actually, I can use this to do it in reverse and make a new picture of a dog or a new picture of a cat. So that's when it becomes a generative model. Well, they use that abstract compressed representation of dogginess to generate a new picture of a dog, right? A novel instance of that species. And it struck me on hearing a description of that one time. I was listening to that and I was like, okay, so that compressed representation is like the genome. And then I thought about it a bit more and I was like, wait, it's really like the genome. I mean, that's this idea of accumulating through training, in which the analogy is now with evolution, a compressed representation, which is a generative model that allows you to decompress through development and generate a new instance of a species. That just seems to be a really apt analogy. And so in this paper, we push on that bit and try and see, does this actually make sense? Because look, both of us are highly aware of the temptation to just appeal to the latest technology as a metaphor for something in biology, right? I mean, there's a long history of doing that in neuroscience and genetics. And so we're very wary of taking this sort of naive metaphor and just running with it. So what we do in the paper is try and push on it a bit and say, does it make sense to think of the genome as a generative model? Is the information there in this kind of compressed representation where there are, it's the details are not in there. What's in there is a set of relations that's highly distributed. It's not localized. It's not isomorphic. It's really distributed, again, in the same way that the representations within machine learning systems are. Where there are sort of concepts of things like latent spaces and latent variables in these representational spaces that become super useful. And those are useful in machine learning. They're useful in neuroscience as well, because in neuroscience we also we appeal to generative models when we were talking earlier about simulating the outcomes of our actions. We can simulate moving within the world. That's employing a generative model to imagine where we would be, what our situation would be if we moved from here to there, right? So that kind of concept, it just feels really powerful. And to me, it feels very apt in terms of thinking about the genome, because it gets away from these really direct one-to-one mappings between bits of the genome and bits of the phenotype. And instead, it captures the much more distributed, collective, sort of holistic nature of those relationships. and also the somewhat plastic nature of them, in that as they're being decompressed, development is this process where the organism is trying to kind of progressively interpret the model as it goes along in ways that are variable, right? So a lot of these machine learning systems, like variational autoencoders, have variation within them, right? And they use that to generate a new instance of a dog that has some variability from this abstract form. And of course, that's what development does all the time, but you don't have to add the noise. The noise is already in there. It's just in the processes of molecular jigglings around, like we talked about earlier in the nervous system. So what development does is decompress that representation, but in a completely idiosyncratic way every time it runs it. Right, so you can start with the exact same genome, and you won't get the exact same outcome, but you get something sort of pretty close. So that was the sort of what engendered the analogy, and there's a bunch more in that paper that pushes on it in different ways and sees what it has to offer.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that. But I mean, when it comes to, let's say that your generative model account is the correct one, how should we put this perhaps in slightly more simpler terms to scientifically communicate this to lay people? Because I mean, as you pointed to earlier, people tend to have this very simplistic idea or picture of one gene corresponds to one trait, or perhaps a bunch of genes correspond to one trait, or perhaps there are traits that are produced, or perhaps some genes play a role in different kinds of traits. But how do we move from that kind of simplistic picture to what you're painting there?
Yeah, it's really tricky because I mean, the appeal of a blueprint, for example, is it's familiar, right? So if you're looking for sort of a science communication metaphor, then obviously appealing to something familiar that people already understand and saying, this complicated thing is like that, and you already understand that, therefore you can grasp what this is, right? I mean, that's the sort of the essence of communication by analogy. The trouble is, like, all of the simple ones that people are familiar with don't work. They're not apt. They're too simple. And so the generative model idea is really tricky and difficult to understand. And we know it is because the people who've done this, trained these machine learning models, now have to do the work of understanding what the representations are inside them, right? So we've created this thing for the first time ever in our existence. We've created artificial systems that we don't understand how they work. It's incredible, right? There's now a natural science of these systems, and people are working on lots of different ways to sort of increase the interpretability of the encodings and so on, so that we can get a better grasp on them. But the point is, it's actually just genuinely very complex, and you get into these really subtle, complicated ideas like latent spaces and orthogonal dimensions in this big multi-dimensional space within this compressed representation. And there you're into like really abstract mathematical objects. They're very hard to wrap your head around. But they're crucial, I think, to understanding that. We're seeing those mathematical concepts applied in neuroscience to great effect. We're seeing them applied in machine learning, and I think we can apply them in terms of genomic encodings as well in really important ways. So, which we could talk about in a minute, but on your real question of like communicating it, I think this is a challenge, right? So how can we get that across? I just don't think we can do it quickly, frankly. I think it just may be the case that this is an instance where the reality is genuinely complex, and it's going to have to take some explaining, and people are going to have to sit with those ideas that are very foreign, alien sort of ways of thinking about things, and do some work to wrap their head around it. There's no easy fix here in terms of the communication. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So let me ask you now, tell us about these concepts coming from developmental biology, robustness and evolvability, and how do they apply to the encoding we are talking about here?
Yeah, so these are really, really crucial. These two properties of robustness and evolvability, which sound like they should be opposed to each other, but they're actually two sides of the same coin. So we talked about earlier, the noisiness in molecular systems and how what evolution has selected for is collectively robust macroscopic organizations that are, in a sense, insensitive to all this sort of momentary fluctuations going on within them, and instead they manage to maintain a regime of activity, right? A regime of dynamical processes that at a macroscopic scale is robust and persistent. So you can think about a single cell as a single-celled organism as trying to do that. And of course, what it does is react to changes in its internal states through homeostatic mechanisms. So it takes some sort of negative feedback. It says, oh no, I've been pushed out of where I want to be. I need to take this action to bring that back down to where it should be, right? And that's basically what a lot of metabolism is doing, and what the responses to external cues and so on are for. Now, in development, you have the same kind of problem. It's just magnified, because instead of one cell state, you've got thousands and thousands of different cell states that you have to make. You have to make them all stable, right? Each of those states now is the sort of, we got these multiplexed options encoded in the genome, right? Where the genome has to encode a liver cell state of some genes on and off as a stable attractor in a dynamical system, and it has to encode a muscle cell state and a nerve cell and all these different, like thousands and thousands, right? And of course, it has to build them in the right order, in the right place, with respect to each other, right? So that's the magic of developmental biology. That's what developmental biologists have been studying for centuries. And we know a lot about the mechanisms whereby embryos get patterned, different cells differentiate in response to different signals, how gene expression is modulated and put into these different patterns, and then stably held in those patterns so that cell types remain what they are, right? So all of that has to be robust, and it has to be robust to noise in the first instance, right? We've got all these molecular stuff jittering around. The systems have to be able to buffer some variation there. Now, the interesting thing is you get something for free when you have a robust system like that, which is evolvability. And the reason is, if the system is robust to all those molecular jitterings, it should also be robust to some genetic variation that maybe says, okay, maybe make a little bit more of this protein or a little bit less of that protein under these conditions. Now, the cell's already used to working with slight variations in the levels of different proteins at different times, right? It's evolved to be robust to that. As a consequence, what happens is genetic variation can build up in the system without affecting the phenotype, right? So the phenotype is channeled into, it's sort of broadly speaking, an optimal outcome, or at least a viable outcome, despite all this noise. Now, that's up until a point when the genetic variation does begin to affect the phenotype, and then you get evolvability. Then natural selection steps in and goes, yeah, I like that, or I don't like that. It's a little bit better, it's a little bit worse, right? So you get this, the robustness allows genetic variation to build up in the population. That becomes then the substrate for evolution. So we don't have to think of evolution as this kind of one step at a time, one big hit, one big mutation totally changes things, right? Mm-hmm. Where like one mutation means lizards suddenly didn't have legs and now they're snakes, and that, like, so mommy and daddy lizard gave birth to a snake. That just isn't the way that evolution happens, right? But it happens in a much more gradual kind of a way, where these collective encodings in the genome that are very distributed, that are affecting different traits, can change over time because of genetic variation, and then evolution can have a say as to whether that's good or not. So you get evolvability, you get gradual evolvability from these two aspects: the distributed encoding and the accumulation of genetic variation because of the robustness of the developmental system.
So, and this is, I think, an idea that comes from also from developmental biology. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but then development can constrain evolution, at least to some extent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, evolution is not, evolution is exploring a possibility space. And that possibility space is determined by where you are now, right? So, yeah, I mean, that just, some people kind of make this out like it overturns Darwinian notions. It's a big challenge to adaptationism, and it isn't. It's just a sort of the context in which that happens, right? Of course, I couldn't have a mutation like Angel in the X-Men and just sprout wings from my back, right? Because that phenotype is not available to me. Okay. I could have a mutation that gives like web fingers. That's a phenotype that's available from my current generative model. I could get from A to B, right? By tweaking the generative model a little bit, you could get there. So it's a question of saying, okay, what's the current generative model? What's the form that's broadly instantiating? And if you tweak it, how can you push that form in different ways, right? So that's just the context of that shapes the possibility space for evolution. And of course, what's interesting there is that every change that you get reshapes the possibility space. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's why evolution is this open-ended creative process, is because the possibility space is not fixed. It's like the video game worlds where as you move around in the world, it populates new things. It's kind of like that, right? So we're moving through this possibility space, new options become available. And I think that's an important way of thinking about the dynamics of evolution through time. It's just, it's a creative process.
So I think you've already addressed this topic, at least to some extent earlier, and this probably also links to the concept of robustness again. But how is then, with all of this noise that we have during the process of development, how is a new individual of a certain type produced reliably?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, again, the robustness is a selected property, a selected collective property of the whole genome, right? Where and the reason that it's there, even though evolution is not trying to make things robust, is just like the ones that don't produce robust offspring don't persist, right? So it's just a kind of an outcome of evolution selecting for genomes that robustly produce viable offspring, given this background of noisy components, right? So robustness is just what emerges from that process without having to be directly selected for. So you can think of the developmental processes as channeling development towards a particular kind of phenotypic attractor state, which is just viable member of the species. And within that, of course, there's going to be lots of variation. So for example, within humans, right, we have an average species typical height, but there's lots of variation around that. And that's fine because it doesn't materially affect survival or fitness or how many offspring we have, right? For the most part. So there can be lots of variation that's simply tolerated in the phenotype. Okay? And then, of course, occasionally you'll get big mutations or big disturbances to the system that produce an outcome that's less well tolerated. And those are conditions that we call diseases or disorders that do have an effect on fitness. And generally what happens is that then they tend to be selected against, right? So we think of evolution as this force of positive selection where it's shaping these cool new things. It's like, oh, look, wings, that's cool. Let me positively select for whatever's making wings or running faster or seeing farther, or, all those kinds of things. But actually, most of the evolutionary action is negative selection. It's saying, nope, 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 don't like that. That's not good. It's just keeping it's just maintenance, basically. It's like keeping bad mutations out of the gene pool. So that kind of process is happening all the time, and that's the reason why we have this the genome is being in a sense protected, because really bad mutations that impair the robustness are being selected against all the time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you use there the word channeling, it came to mind the idea suggested by Conrad Weddington of the epigenetic landscape. I mean, is there any link there?
Yeah, absolutely. So Conrad Waddington in the 40s and 50s, he was an embryologist, and he had some very prescient ideas about the way that development works. And a lot of what I've just been talking about is absolutely informed by his thinking. So he had this structure called the epigenetic landscape, which some of your listeners may have seen. It's a kind of like a rolling, contoured hillside, imagine, slightly sloping down with a little ball at the top, and the ball kind of rolls down, and it can go one way or it can go the other way. But when it goes one way or the other, it kind of gets channeled into these valleys. So what those valleys represent is the possibility space, and in more modern terms, in dynamical systems talk, we would call those attractor states. Right? And in fact, Waddington actually used that term of attractors in the landscape. So he kind of prefigured in this just a visual metaphor the kind of thing that we now see in our really formal mathematical models of cellular differentiation and development, right? So his idea was that those different states could represent, say, a skin cell or a nerve cell, right? But the point is that you don't want to have intermediate cell types. Right? As development is happening, you want to channel individual cells down one trajectory or another to these stable final states that you then want to have maintained. Now, you can sort of expand that, right? You can draw way back and say, you can talk about the whole phenotypic, the whole phenotype of the organism as attractor states, right? So, having 5 fingers on your hand is an attractor state, and development is trying to channel things in such a way that that's a robust outcome, despite the fact that we all have mutations that affect the level of different proteins that are involved in signaling and growth of different fingers and so on, right? So, the job there of the developmental system, again, is to robustly channel the outcome, both at the level of individual cell types and morphogenesis of the whole system. And, I think obviously also the patterning of the brain and the kind of, nature of the organism. We've been talking so far about the form of the organism because that's the most kind of obvious thing to wrap your head around, the form of a cat versus a dog. But there's also the nature of a cat versus a dog, and that is entailed in the form of the brain, right? The way that their brains are wired, and so that becomes a really interesting idea to think about. How evolution is now having an opinion about the behavioral dispositions or tendencies or capacities of different species, and whether that's a good phenotype or not. Behavior becomes a phenotype that is judged, but the underlying substrate is the wiring of the brain, which is just a special instance of the genome, the generative model encoding the form of the organism.
Is there any link between what you explore in this article and the biology of free will?
I guess kind of very broadly conceptually, there are some themes there that I think are interesting. The theme of noise and indeterminacy being harnessed in some way and channeled. Yeah. I think you can make some analogies with the kind of processes we were talking about in deliberation and decision making. They're kind of loose in one sense. I'm a little undecided myself as to how tight or formal those analogies are. But I do think there are some there that are interesting. One aspect of free will that some people talk about is just genetic determinism, where they'll say, look, we can show that your genes affect your personality traits, therefore you were just genetically wired this way. It's just in your DNA, right? And actually, when you look at the way that development actually proceeds, is what you can see is that the generative model in the genome constrains the possibility space, but still tolerates some variation within that space. And so if you're thinking about the wiring of the brain and our personality predispositions, it's actually quite tolerable the way that those things emerge, right? And of course, we won't fully understand or even nearly understand the relationship between wiring of specific circuits and those high-level personality traits, and they probably don't map to individual circuits. They're probably more collective properties, right? But anyway, at least in terms of free will, we can say, look, the genetic deterministic argument just fails, because development is just not deterministic, it's probabilistic. And the relationship between the genome and the eventual outcome has to go through development. It's not a blueprint, right? It has to involve these processes. Those processes are inherently variable. And so at least we can say it's not just your genes that made you the way you are. Maybe it doesn't help, because then you can just say, okay, well, it's the idiosyncratic way that my brain developed that makes me the way I am. And, that's fine. That may absolutely be true. It does get to a different question, which is, in terms of things like genomic predictions, how accurate they could ever be, not just in practice based on what we know, but in principle. Like the nature of the relationship between the genome and the phenotype is just limited. There's other sources of variance that we'll never be able to get at, because they're inherently part of the noise of development.
So, for the last part of our conversation today, I would like to ask you about a recent paper you've written with Dr. Henry Greeley on human embryo editing. I've had Dr. Greeley on the show twice. We focused mostly on the law side of things and perhaps a little bit on the philosophy as well. So, tell us about this paper and how it might link also to the topics you explore in the previous paper we talked about, the genomic code one.
Yeah, so this paper, which I wrote with Hank Greeley and Shai Karmi, was a response to a paper that came out in Nature, which was arguing that that using some sort of statistical models of risk for various disorders that are based on genetic studies, that we could drastically reduce the risk of some common conditions like heart disease, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, diabetes, if we edited the genomes of embryos in multiple sites. Now, the important thing about a condition like schizophrenia is it's quite highly heritable. A lot of the variation between people who get schizophrenia or don't is down to genetic differences, but it's not like there's one gene, right? It's not like cystic fibrosis, where you could say, okay, if I have an embryo, I can genotype this one gene and I'll definitely know with 100% predictive power whether or not it will develop cystic fibrosis, right? So there are some genetic conditions like that, but common conditions like schizophrenia, heart disease, the ones I mentioned, are not like that. They're polygenic. So many, many genetic variants influence them. And probably thousands, right? Probably thousands of genetic variants across the whole genome collectively contribute to differences in individual risk of these conditions. And collectively, they explain some percentage of the variance. Usually it's a low percentage, right? For schizophrenia, the sort of the common variants that we know about in the genome maybe capture about 10% of the variance. Okay. So against that backdrop, the argument was that if you edit as few as 10 sites, 10 of those common sites, each of which has a tiny little effect by itself, you could make a drastic reduction in risk. And the strategy was to identify sites where there was a rare mutation that seemed to be protective, where the common allele at a locus was actually the risk allele. where like 99% of the people in the population carry the risk allele for schizophrenia, which is a weird thing. But there are sites like that where there's a very rare mutation that's, like at 1%, 2% in the population, where people who carry that seem to have a lower risk. Okay, so they looked at those and they said, well, look, most people don't carry those rare protective mutations. So maybe we could edit a bunch of those into an embryo, and now it would be kind of super protected against these conditions. And they use some statistical models which are very mathematically simple. So they basically just say, okay, each one of these has a reduction in risk, statistically speaking, across everyone who carries it, who we surveyed so far, of like, you go from a risk of 1 as a baseline to 0.98 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And then if we add them up, multiple ones, we just add them up together, and that reduces the risk by a certain amount. And if you put 10 of them in, their model suggested a massive reduction. So the paper came out in Nature. It was by Peter Vischer and others, including Julian Salvulescu, who's a biomedical ethicist. And it was surprisingly gung-ho. Like, it was absolutely, first of all, it was just an imagined scenario where we could, in the first instance, make these edits in embryos using CRISPR technology or something else with perfect precision. Okay, so they're just imagining there's no chance of something weird happening, which is not at all where the technology currently is. But even with that, they also just sort of took their statistical modeling at face value. And this basically ignores multiple possible complications and risks. The complications are, we don't know how those, what effects those genetic variants will have when you put them in combination with each other. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no reason to think of this relationship as linear. It's just a handy statistical model. But everything I was talking about earlier with the generative model, these compressed representations, distributed, devolved kind of systems where, they're highly, highly nonlinear. That's why it's complicated to understand them. That's why the people who make the machine learning models can't interpret them, because they're just very, very nonlinear relationships with individual aspects of the thing that they're generating, right? And that's absolutely going to be the same thing true with our genome. So it's a really naive statistical approach to just say, we can just treat these as individual, independent, to put them into this linear model, right? And there's no good, really empirical support for that in terms of predicting for individuals. So there was that. There was the danger of pleiotropy, which is this term which means that a genetic variant that, say, decreases risk of schizophrenia might do lots of other things, right? It might affect lots of other traits. It might increase risk of heart disease. It might increase risk of cancer, right? So we know absolutely that many, many genetic variants are pleiotropic. They affect lots of different traits. So each individual trait is affected by lots of variants, but each individual variant typically affects many traits. So given that complexity, it's very hard to predict a whole array of possible unintended consequences that might arise if you select for protective alleles versus schizophrenia. It's like, okay, well, what comes with that? We don't know, because we just don't have the information on each of those, either individually, definitely not in combination. So those were sort of major issues, and especially with rare alleles. These are alleles, these rare protective alleles. Well, they may be rare for a reason, right? I mean, we talked about negative selection, keeping a lid on, keeping, deleterious mutations at a low frequency. Well, the corollary is, if we see things that are at a low frequency, maybe they're deleterious. And so even if there may be a sort of a beneficial aspect in terms of reducing risk of some condition, it's quite possible that those rare alleles do have some negative effects that could go along with them. So we were really concerned with the tenor of this paper, which took this kind of fanciful idea both technologically and statistically, and really made the argument that not only is this a thing that we could do, but it's a thing that we should do, right? Ethically speaking, Savulescu makes this argument that any time we could intervene anywhere in a way that would be seen as having some benefit, we must do that, right? That's sort of his ethical stance. Whereas, like many other people, I would take instead the precautionary principle as a guide and say, first, do no harm. And another way to put this would be, don't fuck about with a complex system and expect good things to happen. It's like genuinely complex. It's not this thing, you can't linearly decompose it into these different bits. That's just not how it works. That's not the nature of the relationship between genotype and phenotype. So we got a little, I guess, exercised over the tone of it, because it just felt it felt a bit irresponsible, frankly, and it also feeds into this sort of resurgence of eugenics that we're seeing these days, which is weird, and it's really fundamentally based on an idea that we have much more knowledge and much greater predictive power based on genotypic information than we actually do have or ever could have.
It's interesting that you mentioned eugenics, because I was actually going to ask you a little bit about that. I mean, not necessarily about eugenics, but about a specific claim made by certain pro-natalist eugenicists about traits that are probably even more complex genetically than heart disease, even like intelligence, because I've heard some of them claiming that through in vitro fertilization and then embryonic selection, they can select for, they can already select for higher intelligence. But I mean, there are a bunch of complications there. Probably the biggest one is the fact that intelligence, I mean, it seems that there are probably thousands of different genes associated with IQ and all of that. So, I mean, I don't know how many genes they would have to select for or add it to even increase IQ by 1 or 2 points. But I mean, apart from that, or adding to that, what do you think about?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, IQ is an obsession with certain people, and it goes along with certain sort of social stances that are problematic in multiple ways. So IQ, first of all, is a proxy that we use. It's a quantitative measure derived from various tests. Some people say it only measures how good you are at taking IQ tests. I don't think that's right at all. I think IQ actually does capture some aspects of cognition that differ between people in ways that have important consequences in the world. Okay, so we've got this but we have this very imperfect proxy of it. Now, with that proxy, people have done IQ tests or other cognitive tests, or even just taken things like educational attainment, how far people go in education, and then they've looked for genetic variants that are associated with those differences, right? And that's the same way that people found the genetic variants associated with things like risk of heart disease and schizophrenia, right? So they look across whole thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, literally, for sites in the genome where there may be two variants that exists. Like some people might have an A, some people might have a G in this sequence. And then they say, do people with the A end up at the higher end of the IQ spectrum or with greater educational attainment than people with the G, right? So they do that across thousands and thousands and thousands of sites across the genome, and then they find a kind of a catalog of ones that are associated with greater or lower IQ. And then for any individual person, you can go across that whole list and say, well, do you have, at the first one, do you have the plus or the minus version, and that second one the plus or the minus? So you just add them up and you get a normal distribution, and that's called your polygenic score, right? So what you find if you do that is that across the population, the polygenic score really does track the IQ or the educational attainment or cognitive ability, whatever it is that your phenotype was, right? Not just in the population that they developed the tool in, but in a test population. Okay. So when you look at a graph like that, you could say, okay, I'm going to split people by, say, into 10 bins based on their polygenic scores. And for each of those ones, I'm going to plot the mean value in this cognitive test. And then you get a nice linear sort of relationship where people with the highest polygenic score on average score the best. And you could look at that and go, wow, this is great. Look at this great tool we have to predict people's cognitive ability. Now, the problem is that absolutely obscures the fact that there's a whole massive amount of variation that's unexplained, that's not captured by the polygenic score. Because if you look within any of the bins, and you look vertically at the spread of, say, IQ scores, it's huge, right? The average is a little bit higher than the one next to it, but the spread is still huge. So if all you know about somebody is their polygenic score, you have hardly any predictive power for them as an individual, because these are statistical tools. They're for population averages. They're for population variance. They're not designed to predict the phenotype of an individual, and they can't. They're really, really terrible at it, right? So at best, what you could get is a kind of a statistical prediction. So if you have two embryos that are at opposite ends of the polygenic spectrum, statistically speaking, the one at the high end is more likely to have a higher IQ than the one at the low end. But there's a very good chance that it would be the opposite way around, because at each of those, the spread is still huge and the overlap between them is still almost complete. Okay. So there's a question then, like, what do you do with that kind of information? How is that being presented by these companies? And I saw a new one just yesterday spring up that's offering people this kind of custom iPad sort of display to select between their multiple embryos, right? And it's giving this rundown for each embryo of like hair color, eye color, predicted height, predicted IQ, risk of various conditions, and some of them will be higher risk of Alzheimer's, but blue eyes, and lower risk of heart disease, and it's this Gattaca like idea where you could pick these things, right? So it's basically like 23andMe genetic profile, where you send your DNA in and they send you back and say your risk of Alzheimer's is 22%. It might have been 17%, but it's 22%. It's like, oh, okay, what do I do with that information? Nothing, right? So the question is, what do you do with it in terms of embryo selection? And there's very different views, first of all, on whether it's ethical for people to use that kind of information. And the system in the States is very deregulated. You can do whatever you want. The system in Europe is highly regulated. You can only do genetic testing for specific genetic disorders for the most part. But the other question is just like, would it work? Regardless of whether it's a good thing to do or not, just scientifically, technically speaking, would it work? Would having the polygenic score between two embryos actually be a useful predictor? And I think for the reasons I've just talked about, it wouldn't. And especially more so because you're not choosing between people at opposite ends of the spectrum across the whole population. You're not sampling the whole population's worth of variance. You're sampling sibling variance, which obviously is a much narrower range that you would be trying to make discriminations across. So the ability of the polygenic score to actually really predict would be even much, much less in that scenario. So I don't see any actual utility there, and I think the way that these things are being advertised almost amounts to fraud.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to eugenics, and this will probably be my last question today, when it comes to eugenics, of course, the ethics of it is very messy, but even apart from that, there's the science behind it. I mean, there's not much support for the kinds of claims that people make it. I mean, of course, there's also the more subjective aspects of, oh, okay, so we're selecting for better people, or we want better, superior people to procreate among themselves. I mean, whatever that means, I'm not sure. I guess it's kind of arbitrary. But I mean, the kinds of claims that they tend to make in terms of the extent to which it would be possible to change, I don't know, particular populations in terms of their phenotypes, particular kinds of phenotypes, it tends to be very unscientific.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of things about this that are, both I think sort of morally and ethically questionable, but also scientifically. So one of the things that's interesting there is that you made this switch that many of the people in this sort of discourse make, which is, first of all, they'll defend the idea of parental choice and basically what you could call kind of a consumer eugenics, where, right, mom and dad are having a baby by IVF, they got multiple embryos, they already choose between them. I mean, the embryologist chooses between them in terms of just looking at them as to which one is likely to give a healthy pregnancy. They may be using some other genetic information, say they're carriers of cystic fibrosis mutation, right? Yeah. And they know that they are, and they do a genetic test, and they select the embryo that doesn't have, both copies of that gene, right? And many people would say there's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly reasonable, good thing to do. Of course, many embryos are screened for things like chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome, and regularly that's a regular target of embryo selection as well. The question is, like, when you go beyond that, how much scientific efficacy would there be in terms of selecting for against, say, risk of common disorders? There's some. I don't want to say there's none. The problem is, like, one embryo might be high for schizophrenia risk but low for heart disease, and you're sort of mixing and matching. So just on the selection front, that becomes just a technical challenge because there's so much going on, right? So what are you trying to optimize for? And then the question of selecting for traits, especially things like IQ or personality traits and things like that, you get this sense and the rhetoric of better people, higher quality people. I find it very personally, morally repugnant. That's not an argument. That's not a scientific argument. That's my personal feeling about it. I think
and it's not even a scientific claim, right? I mean, better people. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, right? Yes, I can't have a scientific argument to it because it's not a scientific claim, right? Yeah. I have a personal opinion about it that I just find that attitude distasteful. But then okay, so all of that, like, you've got this individual parental choice, and it's interesting if you start really digging into that around the ethics of it. It's actually not that easy to come up with really good arguments against it, because you're moving from one area where it's like obviously okay into areas where it's like, well, okay, I wouldn't do it, but should it not be allowed for anybody? Like, where's the harm? And it become a little bit difficult to talk about that. The more interesting thing here, though, is when it becomes really eugenics, which is a program of gene change across a population. And this is the kind of argument where people move from the idea of just personal parental choice into saying, we should do this for society as a whole. It would be better for society as a whole to have more people like this and fewer people like that. And that is eugenics in a nutshell. And we know the horrid history of eugenics when it's implemented in state kind of a fashion. And we've seen it, people refer most obviously to Nazi Germany, but it had a much longer lifespan in America, for example, where, many, many thousands of people were forcibly sterilized, because they had either sort of intellectual disability or epilepsy or some kind of other, psychiatric disorder or something like that. So, and this was going on into the 1970s. So we know what that looks like. We know where that ends, and it's not a good place. It's horrific, and it's based on these notions that some people are better than others, and like, where better in that case is like it's better for society to have people like that in it. And so again, I just find that morally objectionable, to put it mildly, and something that we need to be cognizant of and on alert for, because those kinds of claims, that rhetoric is coming back. It's based on a flawed understanding of genetics, as well as whatever the sort of morally problematic edifice of arguments that these people make, but it's important, I think, at least as geneticists, that we point out the scientific limitations of it, the limits of genetic determinism, and especially the complexities of the relationship between genotypes and phenotypes, where it's just hubris to think that we can predict things, that we can go in and not just select, but maybe do genome editing and know what the outcome is going to be and not face unanticipated consequences, because complex systems will kick you in the ass, and that's exactly what is likely to happen.
I mean, isn't it also, even from a biological perspective, does it make any sense at all to talk about better traits and worse traits, or good traits and bad traits? I mean, of course, there are perhaps some very rare exceptions, very rare conditions like cystic fibrosis. Okay, probably it's better for no one to have cystic fibrosis, but apart from that, when we're talking about more complex traits and pleiotropic effects and all of that, I mean, does it make sense, even from a pure scientific biological perspective, to say that some traits are good and others are bad?
No, it doesn't. And of course, it's a value judgment, right? So the question is, what is it that you're basing that on? What is it that you value? And if you're a farmer who wants to improve milk yield in his herd of cattle, then great. If that's the trait that you value, then you can select for that trait. And people, of course, have done that. Now, the problem in animal breeding is what happens when they really, really push selection for individual traits like that is these unanticipated consequences start cropping up. Bad things happen. Other traits change in ways that you didn't want. It's why we end up with tomatoes that have no flavor, even though they last on the shelf for weeks and weeks, right? There are salutary lessons to take from the history of animal and plant breeding, where people have done exactly this kind of project, valued one particular trait and pushed it really hard to the detriment of other ones. Now, in human society, the question is, what traits are valued? And there are many different ways that you can look at that. You could say, which traits are associated with life success? And you then you have to define success in some way, where again you're making value judgments. But let's say income, or it could be, you could take an evolutionary approach. You could say number of offspring, right? You could say longevity. You could look at disease burden, right? All of those things are things that you could use in your value judgment. It's just pragmatic. You just make some choices, right? And there are always going to be some trade-offs between those things, because you probably won't be able to maximize them all at the same time. So, that's one way of thinking about value in terms of, for an individual, what's the best way for them to be, for their outcomes, right? But there's another way to look at it, which is like across society, what is the best way, for society to be. And again, you can make arguments there for, say, diversity of cognitive styles is actually really important. If we homogenized everybody to one end of the IQ spectrum, we might have a really limited set of cognitive styles. We might miss out on kind of some aspects of creativity, for example, that are really important in society as a whole. So that's where diversity becomes a value that you could, or a property that you could apply value to, and that would argue against kind of, eugenics approaches that are narrowly focused on one phenotype at a time. So, there are no right or wrong answers to those. They're just pragmatic questions of what we value individually and what we value across society. And I guess what I would say, to take a step back from the actual traits that we're valuing, is to look at the mindset of even thinking about those traits and trying to kind of commodify our children in a way that sort of almost represents them as products, some of which are better than others, some of which are even defective, right? And to me, that having that mindset in place instantiates a set of values that I don't want to embrace myself. I think we can have a set of values which is, here's this amazing diversity of human beings with different forms and different minds, everyone completely unique. Even if there were identical twins, they're still idiosyncratic, never to be repeated again. And that that incredible diversity should be embraced, not just accepted, not just tolerated, but embraced, and we can and celebrate it. So that's the unprespecifiable nature of that human experience, to me is the thing that has the most value. And even engaging in the eugenics kind of mindset, I think, undermines and threatens that appreciation.
Great. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Sure. So I have a website called, it's www.kjmitchell.com, which I need to update. I have a blog site called Wiring the Brain, and I'm on Blue Sky these days mostly. wiringthebrain.bsky.social, I think, is the handle. And of course, if you're interested in any of the academic papers that we've referred to, you can get them on my Google Scholar page.
Yeah, I will also link to them in the description of the interview. So, Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's been a very fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. Great questions as always. Thanks a million.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.